He whispered, "Don't trust her with the will." I froze when my daughter-in-law smiled at the lawyer. The scent of lilies and stale coffee was suffocating. I stood by the grand mahogany casket, the final resting place of my husband, Frank. 68 years old, struck down on a rainy Tuesday by a speeding semi-truck. Not a beautiful death, but a sudden one, which seemed crueler somehow. I am Catherine, 65 years old and a retired ballet dancer. My life was movement and form. Now everything was static, ugly, and grey. My focus had been splintered ever since Frank's last lucid moment in the ICU, just an hour before they turned off the machines. His hand, gripping mine, felt cold even then. "The will, Kate. Promise me," he'd rasped, his eyes locking onto a spot behind my shoulder. "Don't trust her with the will. She knows." He passed before I could ask who she was. I dismissed it, of course. Morphine, confusion, the inevitable fear of a man fading away. But then I saw the smile. It happened as we were leaving the private chapel. The rain was coming down in sheets, making the granite cemetery steps treacherous. Frank's lawyer, Leo, a slick man in a too-expensive suit, held a black umbrella over his head, shielding the important legal documents tucked under his arm. Leo gave a tight, sympathetic nod to Frank's 2 children. My son, David, a quiet but successful finance executive, and my daughter, Olivia, a driven architect. And then he smiled warmly at Ethan, Olivia's husband. Ethan, the artist. The man who had once been so broke he lived in our guest house for months, now wearing a perfectly tailored dark coat. And it was then, just as Ethan stepped under the umbrella with the lawyer, that Olivia's face shifted. Her expression wasn't grief. It wasn't relief. It was a flash of something utterly cold, a calculated, victorious smirk directed right at the lawyer, a look that said, "We won." My body went rigid. The grief, the shock, the sheer physical exhaustion of the last week vanished, replaced by a searing, metallic jolt of pure adrenaline. She knows. Frank's words slammed back into my mind. Who did Frank mean? Olivia, my own flesh and blood, my ambitious, pragmatic daughter, or the artist Ethan, the man Frank always dismissed as a pretender? The funeral reception was held at our huge, silent house on the outskirts of Greenwich. Frank had built his fortune on his art collection, a multi-million-dollar empire of paintings and sculptures. The house was his gallery, now just a mausoleum of quiet wealth. I stood in the corner, watching the players. David was lost in his phone, probably dealing with market reports. He seemed genuinely sad, distracted, but harmless. But Olivia and Ethan, they were a unit. They moved through the room with a practiced ease I'd never noticed before, accepting condolences, but always circling back to Leo, the lawyer. "Mom, are you okay?" David finally approached me, his voice low with concern. "You look like you saw a ghost. Did Leo say anything about the reading?" "The reading?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "No, just that it's scheduled for Monday morning. Plenty of time to mourn," he said. David sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Look, Mum, whatever Dad left, we just want to make sure you're taken care of. But the collection, it's going to be complicated. Millions, maybe 15 million, easy. We should hire a financial advisor, someone outside of Leo, just to what, David?" I cut him off sharply. The thought of all that money, the $15 million Frank had curated over a lifetime, suddenly felt tainted. "Just to make sure no one steals my inheritance." David looked wounded. "No, Mom, just to make sure you're not taken advantage of." Before I could apologize for the venom in my voice, Olivia walked over, her arm looped casually through Ethan's. She wore a delicate, antique brooch Frank had given her. It looked out of place, almost like a costume. "She's just tired, David," Olivia said, her voice dripping with forced concern. "All this stress isn't good for her. We're thinking, Mum, that maybe after the reading you should take a nice long rest, somewhere quiet. We can handle all the inventory and appraisals for the collection." "Handle the appraisals?" I met her gaze, remembering that calculated smile from the cemetery. "You and Ethan?" Ethan gave a practiced, gentle smile. "Of course, Catherine. It's what family is for." I looked at their faces, two perfect masks of filial devotion. Then I looked at the spot behind the sofa, where Frank had once hidden a small, sealed envelope. He used to joke it contained his emergency escape fund. Frank had been an obsessive secret keeper, an architect of elaborate jokes and hidden puzzles. If he suspected something, he wouldn't just tell me. He would leave me a trail of breadcrumbs only I could follow. A trail that led not to a thief, but to a hidden truth. "I'm not tired," I said, my voice now firm, dismissive. "I'm an old dancer. I'm used to exertion. I'm used to pain. And I'm certainly used to the spotlight." I took a deep breath, fixing the smile on my own face, a professional mask honed from years on stage. I needed to find that trail, that hidden escape route, because Frank hadn't just been telling me to watch out for a thief, he'd been giving me my next steps. "The reading is Monday," I announced to them both, raising my chin. "Until then, no one touches a single painting, a single sculpture, or a single portfolio in this house. Is that understood?" Olivia's smile tightened. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. The game had begun, and I was the only one who knew the rules. The funeral guests finally dispersed, leaving the Greenwich mansion in an unsettling, post-grief quiet. I locked the front door and stood in the marble entryway, hearing nothing but the echo of my own heartbeat. I knew I had maybe 48 hours before Leo, David, and the smiling assassins, Olivia and Ethan, would descend for the will reading. 48 hours to find what Frank had hidden. I went straight to Frank's studio. It wasn't a room for working, it was a sanctuary for contemplation, filled with the rare, the beautiful, and the utterly bizarre. Frank was notorious for hiding small, precious things in plain sight. A diamond cufflink inside a chipped teacup, a key tucked into a bronze bust. I began my search, focusing on objects that held sentimental value for us, not monetary value for the market. I wasn't looking for cash, I was looking for a message. My eyes fell on a dusty wooden chest tucked beneath a drafting table. It contained relics from my former life, old toe shoes, tutus, faded photographs of me in impossible poses. Frank had kept it all. I opened the chest and pulled out a pair of my ballet slippers, worn thin at the toes. They were exactly as I'd left them 20 years ago. But as my fingers traced the leather, I noticed something hard, a slight, unnatural lump pressed deep into the sole of one shoe. I carefully peeled back the inner lining. Taped, there was a small antique silver locket. It was the locket Frank had given me on the day of our engagement, but inside, instead of a picture, was a tiny, tightly rolled piece of paper. My hands, usually steady, trembled as I unrolled it. The note was written in Frank's cramped, precise handwriting. "The last dance is in the attic. The key is in the bird's eye." The words hit me like a physical blow. The Last Dance was the name of the final piece I had ever choreographed before I retired. A painful, beautiful solo about letting go. And the bird's eye was what Frank always called the small, intricately carved wooden finch that perched atop his favourite grandfather clock in the study. My heart hammering against my ribs, I hurried to the study, It was a dark, leather-scented room where Frank conducted all his private deals. The grandfather clock stood sentinel against the far wall. I climbed onto a sturdy antique footstool, a necessary act of athleticism for a former dancer, and reached for the wooden finch. It was fixed tight. I twisted it gently, then applied pressure exactly how Frank would have shown me to turn a key. Click. The tiny wooden bird lifted slightly. Beneath it, nestled in the brass housing, was a miniature, tarnished silver key. This was more than a joke now. This was deliberate, a final, intricate performance he'd staged just for me. He had known. He had been preparing. I clutched the key and headed up the back servants' stairs to the dusty, unused attic. The air up there was thick and smelled of cedar and forgotten things. In the center of the vast, open space stood an old, full-length mirror, the kind with a dark, heavy wooden frame. Frank had kept it there since we moved in. Hanging on the mirror was a simple, shimmering leotard, the actual one I had worn for my performance of The Last Dance decades ago. Taped to the mirror's surface, using medical tape, was a cryptic drawing. It was a crude diagram of our living room layout, specifically focusing on the massive Rodin bronze sculpture that was the centerpiece of our collection. A sculpture easily worth over $2 million on its own. But the most critical part of the drawing was not the sculpture itself, but a single, carefully drawn X, marked not on the sculpture, but on the floor directly beneath its granite pedestal. I felt a wave of nausea. Why would Frank mark the floor? I rushed back downstairs, the silver key burning in my hand. In the living room, the Rodin, a twisting, agonized figure, stood silently, anchoring the room. I knelt down and examined the granite pedestal. It was heavy, cemented to the floor. But then I noticed it, a nearly invisible seam running along the bottom molding of the pedestal, near the floor. It wasn't a solid block of stone. It was a heavy, custom-made box designed to look like a pedestal. I inserted the silver key into a tiny, hidden lock near the base. It turned with a satisfying metallic snick. The entire front panel of the pedestal swung open, revealing a small, empty compartment inside. Empty. My heart sank. Then I saw it. Taped to the inside roof of the compartment was a single, fragile sheet of paper. It wasn't a will or an official document. It was a detailed schedule of appointments, meticulously logged, all marked with the initials OE, Olivia and Ethan. The dates were recent, overlapping the final months of Frank's life. The appointments were not with art curators or doctors, but with a series of obscure mortgage brokers, international financiers, and, most damningly, a private investigator who specialized in elder competency cases. They hadn't just been waiting for him to die, they had been planning to declare him incompetent, to steal the collection while he was alive, and if he resisted, to discredit him entirely. My mind raced. If this was the plan, then Frank's accident wasn't an accident at all. And the smile I saw at the cemetery, it was a confirmation that the first stage of their betrayal was complete. They hadn't just murdered my husband. They were now coming for me. My heart was a drum against my ribs. The list of appointments with the private investigator specialized in elder competency cases had to be the key. This wasn't just about stealing money, it was about stripping away Frank's autonomy, his legacy. I knew I needed help, but I couldn't trust anyone in the house. I couldn't even trust my own son, David. He seemed innocent, but his offer to handle the financials now felt like a thinly veiled attempt to get control. I went to my study and pulled out my little black address book. There was only one person I could trust who wasn't family. Richard. He was a retired private investigator who had helped Frank with a few art forgery cases years ago. I called him. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff but kind. "Catherine, my God, I was so sorry to hear about Frank." "Richard, I need your help," I said, my voice low and urgent. "This isn't just grief. I think Frank was murdered, or at least they were trying to ruin him." "Who's they, Catherine?" he asked, his tone shifting to business. "What's going on?" I told him everything. The last dance, the hidden key, the notes about elder competency. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. "Catherine, I'll help you," he finally said. "But this is going to be difficult. You're going up against a lot of money and a lot of power. And if they know you're suspicious, you're in danger." "I know," I said. "I can handle it." "I'll need some information," Richard said. "Can you get me access to Frank's computer files, his email, his financial records, everything?" "I'll do my best," I said. The next morning, I began my hunt. I told David, Olivia, and Ethan that I needed to be alone to grieve. I told them I would stay in my room until the will reading. They seemed to accept it, relieved that I was out of their way. But I wasn't grieving. I was working. I went to Frank's study and began to meticulously search through his files. Frank was an analog man, so most of his records were on paper, not a computer. I found a small leather-bound ledger hidden behind a book on art history. It was Frank's personal record of every piece of art he had ever acquired. As I flipped through the pages, I found a list of recent acquisitions. My eyes immediately fell on a large, bold entry from 3 months ago. Acquired, The Serpent's Embrace. Price, $500,000. I knew this piece. It was a large, modern bronze sculpture that Frank had been fascinated with for months. I remembered him talking about it, but I didn't remember it ever being delivered to the house. I checked the ledger again. Frank had clearly paid for it. But where was it? I went back to Richard and told him about the missing sculpture. "Richard, this is a multi-million-dollar piece of art. It's not something you just lose." "Exactly," he said. "It's a huge red flag. Check with your art curator. Find out who handled the acquisition. Find out where it was supposed to be delivered." I called the art curator Frank had always worked with, a woman named Vanessa. She was a no-nonsense professional with a keen eye for detail. I asked her about The Serpent's Embrace. She was silent for a moment. "Catherine, I remember Frank was very excited about that piece, but I don't think it was ever finalized." The seller backed out at the last minute. "The seller's name?" I asked. "A gallery called The Labyrinth," she said. "They specialize in new, up-and-coming artists. Frank was fascinated with them, even though their reputation was a little shady." I hung up and called Richard. "The gallery is called The Labyrinth, and the curator says the deal was never finalized." "That's a lie," Richard said. "Frank would never have written a check for a deal that wasn't finalized. Something is going on. We need to find out what." I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't trust anyone else. I went back to Frank's studio and found a receipt for a private locker at a storage facility in downtown Greenwich. I slipped out of the house, drove into town, and found the storage facility. The locker was filled with paintings, sculptures, and various art pieces. But in the corner, covered with a dust sheet, was a large bronze sculpture. It was The Serpent's Embrace. But it was different from the one I remembered. This one was broken. Its head had been severed, its bronze body corroded and tarnished. And then I saw the note, taped to the side of the sculpture. It was from Olivia and Ethan. The note read, "Thanks for the help, Dad. We'll be in touch." I froze. They hadn't just sabotaged the sculpture. They had somehow manipulated Frank, convinced him to acquire it, and then sold it for a fraction of its price. They had planned this all along, and Frank had found out. But this was only the beginning. I knew there was more. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. The list of appointments, the missing sculpture, the look on Olivia's face at the funeral. And then I realized something truly terrifying. The note was not just from Olivia and Ethan. It was signed by both of them. And the words, "Thanks for the help, Dad," seemed to suggest that Frank had, in fact, helped them. And that was the final piece of the puzzle. Frank had known. He had known all along that his own children were trying to ruin him, and he had used their greed to expose them. The realization that Frank hadn't just been betrayed, but that he had actively cooperated with his betrayers to expose them, changed everything. The note, "Thanks for the help, Dad," wasn't mockery. It was a receipt for a transaction he had knowingly played into their hands. I put the note and the knowledge of the broken sculpture aside. I had to focus on the immediate threat, the will reading on Monday. I needed to understand what Olivia and Ethan's ultimate goal was and how they planned to discredit me. The answer lay in the list of appointments with the private investigator, Richard confirmed. The investigator, a man named Marcus Thorne, was notorious in New York and Connecticut for specializing in pre-probate documentation. In simple terms, he built cases to prove elderly people were mentally unfit to manage their wealth. "Thorne doesn't come cheap, Catherine," Richard told me over a crackling phone line. "They spent a lot to build a file on Frank, and they probably have one started on you now." "A file on me? Why?" "If they can't invalidate Frank's will, they invalidate the executor," Richard explained patiently. "If Frank named you the sole executor and beneficiary, and they prove you're unstable, say, suffering from early-onset dementia or undue influence, the court will appoint a neutral guardian. Guess who that guardian will be? Someone on their payroll. Or maybe David, who seems clean, but is easily manipulated." The sheer coldness of the plan chilled me more than the thought of murder. This was about stripping away a person's dignity and agency, turning a vibrant life into a medical liability. I decided to strike first. I knew where Thorne worked, a nondescript building in Stamford. I needed to see what evidence they had gathered on Frank, and what they might be preparing for me. I drove my old Mercedes into Stamford that afternoon. I wasn't an assassin. I was a dancer. But dancers know how to move through space without making a sound. We know angles and timing. Thorne's office was on the 6th floor. Richard had managed to get me a keycard for an hour. "In and out, Catherine. If they catch you, it's criminal trespass, and their case against you will write itself." The office was predictably sterile. I found Frank's file in a locked cabinet labeled WZ Pending Estates. Inside, it was worse than I imagined. It contained surveillance photos of Frank looking disoriented on the street, transcripts of arguments he'd had with Olivia about money, and manipulated medical records, suggesting memory lapses. But the most alarming items were several pages detailing Frank's obsession with a small, rare diamond ring he had recently acquired. The report claimed Frank was hiding the ring, obsessively moving it, and suffering paranoid delusions that the thieves were coming for the sparkle. The report concluded, "Subject displays erratic behavior, suggestive of severe cognitive decline and inability to manage the $15 million collection. It was a total fabrication, designed to paint Frank as a madman." But then, as I flipped through the final pages, I found the file on me, labeled Catherine Contingency. The file was thin, but terrifyingly targeted. It didn't focus on dementia, it focused on my past as a dancer. It included a psychological evaluation, suggesting that dancers, due to years of physical stress and demanding perfectionism, often suffer from narcissistic personality disorder and histrionic tendencies later in life, making them emotionally volatile and fiscally reckless. They weren't trying to prove I was senile. They were trying to prove I was crazy. There was a final damning piece of evidence: a certified letter to a psychiatric facility in upstate New York, confirming a reserved spot for me for involuntary evaluation the day after the will reading. I gasped, pressing my hand against my mouth to stifle the sound. They weren't just planning to steal the money. They were planning to institutionalize me. They were going to steal my freedom. I quickly photographed every page of both files with the burner phone Richard had given me. As I slid the Frank file back into the cabinet, I noticed something small and metallic taped inside the folder's spine. It was a tiny gold charm, a miniature ballet shoe. My ballet shoe. Frank had been here. He knew Thorne had the file, and he had hidden a final message right in the belly of the beast. Attached to the charm was another tiny scroll of paper, even smaller than the first. It read, "The serpent is not the enemy. The serpent is the key. The true deed is in the soul dart. Look for the missing frame." The serpent's embrace wasn't the enemy. It was just a decoy. The real prize, the true deed, was hidden in a piece of art that had been sold. Not the one they broke, but a completely different one. I slipped out of the office just as the clock in the hall struck 6 o'clock p.m., my allotted hour. I barely made it to the elevator. My legs were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of discovery. I drove back to Greenwich, knowing I was in a race against time. I had less than 48 hours to find the soul dart, and in doing so, expose the conspiracy that had killed my husband and was about to bury me. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a fugitive, and my family was coming for me with a search warrant and a court order. The threat of institutionalization was a cold, sharp fear that cut deeper than any financial loss. They weren't just after the $15 million collection. They wanted to erase me. The will reading was Monday morning. I had less than 36 hours. I called Richard immediately. I told him about the contingency file, the psychiatric evaluation, and the ballet shoe charm. "Catherine, this changes the game completely." Richard's voice was grim. "They're not just trying to prove Frank was confused. They're painting you as the unreliable, hysterical widow. We have to move the pieces now, fast." "Frank left me one more clue," I said, reciting the scroll's message. "The true deed is in the soul dart. Look for the missing frame." Richard groaned. Frank was playing chess when everyone else was playing checkers. The sold art. That means a piece that's already left the collection. "Which piece, Catherine? Out of 500 paintings, which one is it?" I went back to the ledger, the one listing all Frank's acquisitions and sales. I scanned the last 2 years of entries, ignoring the multi-million-dollar transactions and looking for the smaller, less important sales, the kind that might slip through a hurried inventory. I found an entry from 6 months ago, marked simply, "Sold, Dancer's Still Life, 1955. It was a small, obscure abstract canvas, mostly known for its unusual heavy plaster frame. Frank had sold it for a modest $85,000 to a gallery in New York City called The White Room, specializing in mid-century American abstracts. "The frame, Richard," I breathed, tapping the page. Frank loved that painting, but he hated that gaudy frame. Why would he sell it if he was planning to hide something inside? "He didn't sell it, Catherine. He made them think he sold it," Richard corrected. "He was setting a trap. He knew Olivia, or maybe David, was skimming the books. They'd mark a minor piece sold to pocket the money and assume Frank wouldn't notice. But Frank hid the real prize inside a piece they documented as gone. This was the first true evidence of Michael's deep involvement. He had used a seemingly innocent sale to hide something massive. I told Richard the name of the gallery, the White Room. I can't go to New York, I said. They're watching the airport, the train station, everywhere. If I disappear, they'll use it as proof that I'm erratic. Then you don't disappear, Richard said. You send a proxy, a dancer, a performer. I knew exactly who to call. Clara, my former protégée. A brilliant, ambitious dancer who now owned a thriving contemporary dance studio in Brooklyn. She was fiercely loyal to me and Frank. I reached Clara through the burner phone. I kept the explanation brief, urgent, and dramatic, just enough to pique her curiosity without revealing the stakes. Clara, I need a performance, I whispered into the phone. A very specific, unauthorized, high-stakes performance at a gallery called The White Room tomorrow afternoon. Clara laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. Catherine, what kind of trouble are you in? Is this about money? It's about life, I said. I need you to get into that gallery. Find a painting called Dancer's Still Life, 1955. You're looking for the frame. It's not a normal frame. It's the key to everything Frank and I built. I gave her the code word, a ballet term we had shared for years. Fouetter. The next morning, Sunday, I received a confirmation text from Clara. Fouetter initiated, showtime at 2 p.m. Meanwhile, the psychological warfare at the Greenwich House had begun. Olivia and Ethan staged an intervention. They walked into the kitchen as I was making tea, their expressions heavy with rehearsed sympathy. "Mum, we've been talking," Olivia began, her voice soft and dangerously patronizing. "About the will, and about you." Ethan nodded sadly. "We think you've been under a lot of stress, Catherine. You know, Frank's death, the shock. It's natural to feel disoriented." "I am perfectly oriented, Ethan," I replied, sipping my tea, my hand steady as a rock. "I know exactly where I am, and I know exactly who I'm talking to." "That's exactly what concerns us," Olivia pressed, leaning forward. "You're talking about Frank's accident, hinting at foul play. You called Leo yesterday, accusing him of mismanaging funds. We had to smooth things over." This was a lie. I hadn't called Leo. They were gathering fabricated evidence for Thorne's file in real time. "I see," I said, trying to mimic their detached professional tone. "So you're saying I'm confused?" "We're saying you need support, Mum," Ethan chimed in. "A professional assessment. David agrees. He's worried sick about you." "David is worried," I repeated. "And David is busy. So you two volunteered to step in as my guardians, is that right?" Olivia's eyes flickered, betraying her. "It's about protecting you from yourself, Catherine." I set my teacup down. "Protecting me from the $15 million I'm about to inherit, or protecting me from revealing how the two of you murdered my husband?" The masks dropped instantly. Ethan's jaw went rigid. Olivia's face flushed a violent red. "You have no proof, you old lunatic," Ethan hissed, his voice shattering the controlled facade. "If you breathe a word of this, we will have you locked up by sundown tomorrow. We have the papers. The judge signed them last night." The threat was real, immediate. They weren't waiting for the will reading. They were going to execute the competency order on Monday morning. I stood up, moving with the cold, deliberate grace of a predator. I didn't raise my voice. "You can't lock up a truth, Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can only bury it. And Frank never liked things buried." I watched them storm out, their confidence shaken but not broken. They knew I was onto them, but they still held the legal high ground. My only hope was Clara. She had to find the frame, and she had to find it fast. I had set up the first act of my defense, a diversion, a high-risk extraction. Now, I just had to pray that my former student could dance her way through a criminal conspiracy. The clock on the mantelpiece in the living room ticked mercilessly. It was 2:05 p.m. on Sunday. Clara's performance at the White Room Gallery was underway, which meant Olivia and Ethan's paranoia level was peaking. I needed to move, but I couldn't risk leaving the house. They were definitely watching. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara. Target located. Frame is massive. Too many eyes. Need a distraction. I texted Richard. Gallery needs a major diversion in 5 mins. Think art critic meltdown. Already on it, Richard replied instantly. I have a contact. The White Room's reputation is about to be shredded online. I went to Frank's study and pulled out his old art acquisition ledger again. I had to focus on the sold art piece, Dancer's Still Life, 1955. Frank's note had mentioned the missing frame. I looked up the painting's entry in the ledger. Beneath the sale price of $85,000, Frank had scribbled a tiny, almost illegible note in Latin. Non est quod videtur. It means, it is not what it seems. I remembered the frame. It wasn't just gaudy. It was 3-dimensional, made of heavy plaster, decorated with abstract floral patterns and strange bulbous growths. Frank had always called it that monstrosity. If the frame was the key, it had to contain the true deed. But what was the true deed? It couldn't be a paper document. That would be too simple. It had to be something with legal weight, something that instantly invalidated the entire estate, something that Frank had used to set the final, inescapable trap. My phone rang. It was Clara, her voice breathless and tight. Catherine, I'm out. It was a zoo, she whispered, the background noise a cacophony of sirens and shouting. Richard's diversion worked perfectly. Some famous critic apparently posted a video calling the entire gallery collection derivative garbage. Everyone rushed to their phones. Did you get the frame? No, I got a frame, Clara corrected, her voice dropping. It was huge, heavy. I couldn't lift it off the wall, but I got close. I touched the plaster. It's hollow, Catherine. It's not plaster at all. It's some kind of synthetic resin, designed to hide something. Did you see the painting itself? Yes. And this is the twist, Catherine. The painting, it's not the still life you described. It's a self-portrait of Frank. It's him, but in his army uniform, standing stiffly. I froze, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white. Frank, the art collector, had served a brief, unmentioned stint in the military during the Vietnam era, something he never spoke of. Frank hated having his picture taken, I whispered. He certainly never painted a self-portrait. That painting is a forgery. The real one is gone. No, Catherine, listen to me, Clara insisted. The painting is definitely a forgery, a cheap copy pasted onto the canvas. But the frame... I used the pin I found in the dancer's shoe, the one you told me to keep. I pushed it into the plaster where the frame meets the canvas. It clicked, and something fell out. What was it, Clara? A military dog tag, Catherine. Frank's dog tag. And etched on the back, not engraved but deeply carved, are 3 numbers, 41 to 72, 91. A military dog tag. Not a deed, not a document, just a piece of metal with numbers. This was the true deed. This was the elegance of Frank's trap. It was something they would never, ever look for. Clara, get out of the city now. Do not talk to anyone. Call me from a secure line in an hour. I hung up and paced Frank's study. 41, 72, 91. These couldn't be vault combinations. They were too simple. They weren't dates. They weren't bank account numbers. Then it hit me. Frank, the artist, the curator, the perfectionist. He organized his entire life by the Dewey Decimal System, the ancient library classification used for organizing knowledge. Frank always joked that everything was just information, waiting to be categorized. I flew to the library section of the study, specifically the section dedicated to art history and military conflicts. 41 was the primary category. 72 was the subcategory. 91 was the specific book. I scanned the shelves. Category 41, Military Memoirs. Then subcategory 72, Post-War Finance and Asset Protection. Book 91, The Legal Loopholes of Offshore Trusts. There it was, a dusty, anonymous-looking legal textbook. I pulled it off the shelf. The book wasn't about legal loopholes, it was a distraction. I flipped through the pages. The center of the book had been hollowed out. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was the dog tag's mate. Frank had served briefly in an overseas deployment, where he met a soldier who became a legal expert in offshore finance. Frank hadn't hidden a single document. He had hidden a system. The second dog tag was blank on the front. But on the back, micro-etched so tiny it required a jeweler's loupe to read, were 2 lines of text. 1. Trust. The Last Dance. Perpetual Foundation. 2. Date of establishment. 1 day prior to the alleged accident. Frank hadn't left a will. He had liquidated all of his major assets, the entire $15 million collection, through a series of complex, untraceable offshore transactions, and legally transferred everything into an irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a ghost. It can't be contested, stolen, or assigned to an incompetent person. It existed entirely outside the jurisdiction of probate court. This was the true deed. The dog tag wasn't a deed. It was the proof of establishment of a non-contestable trust. Frank's dog tag was the key to a massive, irrevocable trust. If I had died, the beneficiaries would have been the foundation itself, with no executor needed. If I lived, I became the sole trustee, the administrator of the entire $15 million fortune. But the final twist, the true depth of Frank's strategy, was the kicker. The trust contained a single, binding clause. If any family member is found to have legally contested the terms of this trust, or the mental competency of the trustee, Catherine, their future inheritance rights in the trust are irrevocably forfeited. They hadn't just wasted their time gathering evidence for the competency hearing, they had fallen into the ultimate legal trap. By filing the papers to have me declared unfit, they had already triggered the forfeiture clause. They had legally signed away their own rights. I put the dog tag back in the book, my hands shaking uncontrollably, this time not from fear, but from the overwhelming brilliance of my husband's final act. I had everything I needed. Now I just had to survive the night. The moment of discovery, the micro-etched dog tag confirming the irrevocable trust, was the turning point. Frank hadn't left me a mess to clean up. He'd handed me a loaded weapon, but the weapon was useless if I was locked away in a psychiatric facility. I drove back to the mansion under the cover of a dense, autumnal fog. It was dark now, the vast, expensive house looking like a black silhouette against the grey sky. I called Richard. I told him about the trust, the dog tag, and the irrevocable forfeiture clause. He let out a loud whoop of disbelief over the phone. "Catherine, you have done it. That man was a genius. That trust is airtight. The moment they file the competency challenge tomorrow, they sign away their inheritance. It's beautiful, clean, and utterly untraceable." "Beautiful, yes," I said, looking at the silent house. "But they're coming for me, Richard. They know I suspect them. They'll execute the competency order tomorrow morning before I can even show the dog tag to Leo. We need proof that they're planning to restrain you, Richard said, his voice instantly serious. We need to catch them in the act of coercion or confinement. The police won't help you with a crazy family dispute, but they will respond to a kidnapping. How can we get them to commit to confinement? I asked. You need to make them panic, he replied. They think you're vulnerable, grieving, and easily manipulated. You need to look vulnerable, but act like a threat. They need to believe you have the real will and are about to expose them. I spent the next hour preparing the ultimate performance. It wouldn't be ballet, it would be theatre, designed to provoke a deadly response. First, I retrieved a small antique pistol Frank had kept locked in his desk, a relic from his brief military service. I checked the chamber. It was loaded. I placed it discreetly in the waistband of my silk robe. I was an old woman, but I was armed. Next, I went to the dining room, where a magnificent, custom-built Venetian mirror hung over the sideboard. I took a piece of my bright red lipstick and scrawled a single defiant message across the glass. I know. Then the performance began. I went to the main living room, where the Rodin sculpture sat on its deceptive pedestal. I turned on all the lights, the massive chandeliers bathing the room in harsh, brilliant white. I walked to the stereo system, an old, temperamental setup Frank had built, and put on my favorite piece of music, Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. Loud, too loud. A frenetic, chaotic score that always made Frank say, "It sounds like a chase scene, Kate." I started to dance, not the fluid, graceful movements of a prima ballerina, but a wild, erratic, almost frightening display of emotion. I spun. I collapsed. I pounded the floor. All the movements designed to appear completely unhinged, exactly the kind of behavior they had documented in Thorne's file. I knew the neighbors would call the police about the noise, but more importantly, I knew Olivia and Ethan had the house under surveillance. They would see this. Sure enough, my phone buzzed at 9:30 p.m. It was David. "Mom, what is that noise? The neighbors are calling me. Are you okay? What are you doing?" I didn't answer. I texted back a single cryptic message. The dog tag knows. He was right. You lost everything. Within 15 minutes, a black SUV, one I recognized as Ethan's leased vehicle, flew up the gravel drive, followed closely by a smaller sedan. They hadn't called the police or the lawyer. They had come themselves, panicked, furious, and ready to contain the situation before I could say anything public. I turned the music volume up even higher, the frenetic timpani and strings shaking the glass in the windows. I quickly slipped the dog tag into the interior pocket of my robe, secured the pistol, and extinguished all the lights in the house, except for the harsh, theatrical glare of the living room. I hid behind the heavy velvet curtains in the grand hallway, the cool marble against my bare feet. The front door burst open. It wasn't just Olivia and Ethan. There were two other men, large, silent, and dressed in matching black tactical gear. Security muscle. They were prepared for a fight. "Catherine, stop this madness!" Olivia's voice was sharp, desperate, cutting through the music. Ethan looked at the Venetian mirror with the bright red lipstick scrawl. "She's completely broken. Get the restraints." "Where's the will, old woman?" one of the security men growled, moving toward the hallway. They didn't waste time asking questions. They went straight to the competency report, straight to the physical restraint. I waited until they were fully committed, fully inside the house, fully focused on the living room. The heavy, syncopated rhythm of Stravinsky's score was my cue. I knew this was my last dance, and I wasn't going to miss a beat. They thought they were hunting a frightened widow. They were about to be trapped by a seasoned performer. The house was dark, but the living room, bathed in the harsh theatrical light, looked like a stage set for a violent opera. Stravinsky's chaotic score was still blasting, a perfect cover for movement. I heard Ethan's voice snap. "She's playing games. Olivia, check the kitchen. You two, search upstairs. I'm taking the main floor." The two hired men, large and heavy-footed, thundered up the central staircase. Olivia, surprisingly agile, headed toward the back of the house. Ethan, pistol drawn, stepped into the living room, his eyes instantly locking onto the empty pedestal where the Rodin sculpture usually stood. He didn't see me in the shadows. He only saw the potential for ruin. This was my moment. As a dancer, I had learned two things: how to utilize gravity and how to use space to misdirect. I slipped out from behind the curtain, staying low, moving along the wall opposite Ethan. He was busy looking at the "I know" scrawled in lipstick on the mirror, his focus split between fury and panic. "You lunatic! Where is it?" he yelled, aiming his weapon at the air. He thought I had the physical will, the paper, somewhere in the room. I didn't answer. I made a sudden, sharp noise, a small object skittering across the polished floor near the dining room entrance. It was Frank's heavy silver letter opener, which I had placed there earlier. Ethan spun, his attention completely diverted. As he moved toward the sound, I seized the opportunity. I launched myself across the 10-foot expanse of the grand hall rug, a movement rooted in decades of professional training. It wasn't a graceful leap. It was a desperate horizontal sprint, designed to cover distance fast. I slammed myself against the base of the central staircase. He heard the impact and turned back, his eyes widening as he finally located me, hunched over, breathing hard. "There you are, you crazy old woman," he snarled, advancing. "Don't move. The judge signed the commitment order this morning. You're coming with us." "You think a piece of paper stops a murder charge, Ethan?" I retorted, pulling the antique pistol from my waistband. The old, heavy gun felt cold and solid in my hand. I wasn't going to shoot him, but I needed the visual deterrent. He froze again, his eyes flicking from my face to the gun. The shock was palpable. They had planned for a nervous breakdown, not an armed standoff. "You brought a gun to a will reading," he mocked, but his hand was trembling slightly. "You just proved my point, Catherine. You are unstable. Put it down." "It's not a will reading, Ethan. It's a conspiracy," I corrected. "And this is Frank's gun, the one he used to protect himself. He knew you killed him." The word "killed" sliced through the Stravinsky music, silencing the room. A loud crash came from the second floor. One of the security men must have tripped over a carefully positioned obstacle, a loose Persian rug maybe, or a discarded footstool. It bought me precious seconds. "You have no proof," Ethan screamed. "We had the accident report. The doctor confirmed the cardiac event. You're lying." "The accident report was faked," I said, my voice low and confident. "The cardiac event was induced. You had help, Ethan. The art appraiser, the one who confirmed the dancer's still life was sold. He was your accessory. He confirmed the transaction, so you could hide the true deed inside the empty frame." He didn't flinch at the accusation of murder, but the mention of the true deed hit him like a physical blow. His composure fractured. "What deed? What frame are you talking about? The collection is secured in the estate. Stop talking nonsense." "The truth is never nonsense, Ethan," I said, slowly raising my left hand and pulling the small metallic item from my pocket, the military dog tag with the micro-etched text. The harsh light caught the metal, making it gleam. "This isn't a will, Ethan. This is the irrevocable trust. All $15 million of Frank's wealth is already gone, legally untouchable. You and Olivia filed the competency papers, which means you just forfeited every cent of your future inheritance. You killed Frank for nothing. The silence was deafening, the Stravinsky music forgotten. Ethan's face went white. The colour drained from him so fast he looked like a plaster cast. The reality of the absolute failure of his meticulously planned crime, the murder, the conspiracy, the institutionalization plan, was a physical devastation. Before Ethan could react, Olivia's panicked voice echoed from the kitchen. "Ethan, they're gone. The files. The financial files we had hidden in the utility closet. Someone was here before us." The second twist. My son David, who I had dismissed as merely distracted, was not the mastermind. But had he been working against them, or for himself? Ethan roared. "It was David! That little bastard! He was skimming the books. He knew about the trust. Find him!" He charged at me, no longer aiming the gun, but lunging with a desperate, animalistic intent to grab the dog tag. I didn't run. I couldn't. Instead, I executed a move I hadn't performed in decades. A sudden, sharp pivot combined with a full-body drop, a move meant to evade a partner on stage. As I dropped, Ethan stumbled over my position, his momentum carrying him forward right into the heavy granite pedestal. The impact was loud, sickening. The $2 million Rodin pedestal, already loosened by my earlier work, cracked. The heavy granite facade buckled, sending Ethan sprawling to the floor, stunned, his pistol skidding across the room. "Olivia! Help!" he choked out, clutching his head. I picked up the discarded pistol, my heart pounding a victorious rhythm. "It's over, Ethan," I said, standing over him, holding both weapons steady. "Your dance is done." But just as I secured the two pistols, the front door burst open, and David, my son, stood there, not in a suit, but in a windbreaker, his face grim. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man I didn't recognize, holding an FBI badge. The moment David appeared in the doorway, everything I thought I knew about him shattered. He wasn't the silent, oblivious businessman. He was alert, his eyes rapidly scanning the chaos. The overturned furniture, Ethan bleeding near the pedestal, and me, an old woman holding two pistols. "Mom! Drop the guns!" David yelled, taking a protective step back. The man beside him, mid-40s, wearing a worn leather jacket, held up a shield-shaped badge. "FBI. We're locking down the premises. Everyone freeze." FBI. The final dizzying twist. Olivia rushed in from the kitchen, seeing the scene. "FBI? What the hell is this, David? Did you call them? This is a family matter." "It stopped being a family matter when you killed Dad, Olivia," David said, his voice cold and steady. He had transformed from the quiet executive into something entirely different, a calculating strategist. Ethan, still dazed, tried to crawl away. "The trust! The papers diz! She's lying! She's insane!" The agent ignored him. "Catherine," he addressed me directly, "I'm Agent Harrison. Your son, David, reached out to us 4 months ago. We need you to surrender the weapons and explain what exactly is going on." I slowly lowered the pistols, my hands aching from the tension. I hadn't been prepared for this outcome. I had prepared for murder, for institutionalization, but not for David to be the hero, working with the FBI. "David?" I looked at my son, betrayal and confusion battling with a surge of relief. "You knew all this time?" "I knew Ethan was crooked," David admitted, stepping forward cautiously. "Dad called me from the hospital before the accident. He didn't trust Leo, and he definitely didn't trust Ethan. He asked me to investigate some irregularities in the collection's sales ledger." "The $85,000 Dancer's Still Life?" I asked. David nodded. "It wasn't a normal sale, Mum. It was a cover. Dad knew Olivia and Ethan were using the gallery, the labyrinth, to siphon money. They would buy cheap forgeries for a few thousand, swap them with the originals, and claim the originals were sold off the books. Dad wanted proof. And the files they had on me? I took them, David said, a hint of pride in his voice. I broke into Thorne's office earlier tonight. That's why Olivia was screaming about the missing files. I knew they were planning to use them against you tomorrow. I looked at the FBI agent. So you know about the trust, the forfeiture clause? Agent Harrison gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. We know Frank established an irrevocable trust precisely to protect his assets from the probate process and to ensure they were never contested by his greedy heirs. He was a brilliant man, Catherine. He set a trap that was legally inescapable. Ethan, finally managing to sit up, stared at David with pure hatred. You knew about the trust. You didn't tell us. Of course I didn't tell you, David sneered. I wasn't trying to steal the money, I was trying to save it. And Dad's death, Ethan? The cardiac event after the accident? Was that part of the cleanup? Ethan remained silent, his eyes darting frantically towards Olivia, who was now being detained by a second FBI agent who had entered the house. Agent Harrison cut in, his voice firm. We have enough evidence to detain both Mr. Ethan and Mrs. Olivia for conspiracy, attempted fraud, and questioning related to the suspicious circumstances of Frank's death. The evidence David provided, coupled with the files and the presence of armed security, is sufficient. The two hired security men, realizing the jig was up, meekly put their hands up as the FBI swarmed the house. The grand, chaotic performance was now turning into a sterile, methodical police procedure. Olivia, handcuffed, fought fiercely, screaming at David. You traitor, you ruined everything. We were going to be set for life. You were going to kill my mother and my father for a painting, David stated flatly. That's not a life, Olivia. That's a jail sentence. As they led Olivia away, she locked eyes with me. There was no repentance, only venomous hatred. Enjoy the trust, Catherine. You'll be alone and crazy when the money runs out. I didn't flinch. I had survived the worst of her. Agent Harrison turned to me. Catherine, we still need to talk about the guns and the matter of trespassing, but given the circumstances and the fact that you stopped a violent confrontation, we will treat you as a victim and a key witness. He paused, lowering his voice. There's one more thing. David provided this to us 4 months ago. Frank asked him to hold it, only to be released if something happened to him. Harrison handed me a small, sealed USB drive. It's a video file, Frank's final message. I looked at David, who was now leaning against the wall, utterly exhausted. He had carried this secret, this immense burden, for months. He hadn't been indifferent. He had been operating in silence, playing his own long game. You saved me, David, I whispered. No, Mum, he said, shaking his head. Dad saved us both. I just played the part he assigned me. He knew I was the only one they wouldn't suspect. The realization settled over me. Frank hadn't distrusted David. He had trusted him completely, assigning him the silent, crucial role of the inside man, the one to retrieve the files and call the cavalry. My husband was a true master choreographer, orchestrating his own revenge from the grave, utilizing everyone, including the FBI, as his dancers. And now, I had his final bow. The living room, once a stage for elegance, was now a crime scene. FBI agents moved with quiet, professional precision, documenting the overturned furniture, the lipstick scrawl on the mirror, and the damaged granite pedestal. I sat with David on the bottom step of the staircase, the silence finally settling over the chaos. Agent Harrison was upstairs, managing the arrests and securing the evidence. I held the sealed USB drive in my hand, Frank's final testament. "Why didn't you tell me, David?" I asked, the question heavy with months of doubt. "Why let me think you were so distracted, so uncaring?" David leaned his head back against the banister. He looked completely drained. "It was Dad's design, Mum. He said they needed to believe I was either too busy or secretly on their side. He was worried if they knew I was onto them, they'd target me before I could secure the evidence." He paused, then confessed. "When Dad called me from the hospital, he didn't whisper, 'Don't trust her.' He said, 'Trust David, but don't show it.' He wanted me to act indifferent. He needed me to keep my distance so I could move the pieces." "The files," I mused. "Did you know about the irreversible trust?" "No," David admitted, shaking his head. "I just knew he was creating something airtight. He gave me the USB and told me, 'If Kate's still standing after the funeral, give her this. If she's not, the FBI will find it in my safe deposit box.' He set a deadline for them, Mum. He knew they'd move fast to try and discredit you. He forced them to expose themselves." Frank's plan was more layered than any of his complex art installations. He wasn't just protecting the money, he was proving my son's loyalty and exposing my daughter's darkness. "It's time to watch the video, Catherine," Agent Harrison said, coming down the stairs. "We need to know exactly what Frank knew about the accident." We moved into the study. David quickly plugged the USB into Frank's secured computer, the same computer where Olivia and Ethan had hoped to find evidence of Frank's mental decay. The screen flickered to life. Frank appeared, sitting at this very desk. He looked frail, his face hollowed by his recent illness, but his eyes were sharp and clear, the eyes of a man with total lucidity. "Hello, Catherine," Frank began, his voice surprisingly strong. "If you are watching this, it means two things. One, I was right. Two, you survived their initial attack. I always knew you would. You're the strongest person I know." He smiled, a familiar, heartbreaking expression. "I need you to understand something crucial about the accident," Frank continued, leaning forward. "The traffic collision was real. It was a random, unavoidable tragedy. Olivia and Ethan didn't cause the accident. They couldn't. They weren't that competent." I gripped the arms of the chair. This was the most powerful twist of all. The murder didn't happen. "However," Frank's voice continued, "they saw the chance and they took it. I was in the hospital recovering when they visited. They were subtle, but clear. They offered to help me liquidate the assets, mentioning my fading mind. They were already working with Thorne." He lowered his voice, the sound becoming heavy with pain. "They didn't murder me, Catherine. But they created the conditions for me to choose my end. They knew I was a liability. The art world, the constant demands, they were exhausting me. After the accident, I realized I didn't want to live in fear of my own children, constantly fighting over the money I had made." Frank reached down and picked up the dog tag I had just retrieved from the library. The irrevocable trust was ready. The forfeiture clause was the failsafe. It only needed to be activated. "So what happened in the hospital?" I whispered, tears finally blurring my vision. Frank looked directly into the camera. "I made a choice, Catherine. I was tired. I was in pain. And I realized my greatest work of art could be my final performance. I told David to call the FBI and give them the evidence of their fraud. Then I called Olivia and Ethan and told them I had hidden the will and they had to find it before the lawyers did. I gave them hope, Catherine. Hope is the most effective trap." Frank paused, his eyes softening. "And then I asked the hospice nurse, the kind, unsuspecting woman, to give me one final, unauthorized dose of pain medication, a strong one, not to kill me, but to put me into a deep, peaceful sleep. I signed the DNR hours earlier. They simply turned off the machines after I was gone. He smiled sadly. I chose to die on my own terms, activating the trust, knowing that in their greed, they would immediately rush to invalidate your mental competency. They would prove my point for me, securing the foundation and ensuring they lost everything. Their ambition made them confess without speaking. Frank's face dissolved into tears on the screen. I'm sorry, my love. I couldn't bear to live in a world where my children could plot against you. I used their darkness to secure your light. The whole collection, all $15 million, is safe, and it's all yours to control. The trust is called The Last Dance. It's my final gift to the only person who ever truly saw me. The screen went black. A profound silence filled the room. Frank hadn't been murdered, but he had orchestrated his own assisted death to defeat his children. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, an ultimate act of cynical love. David quietly stood up. He didn't just save the money, Mom. He saved me from having to choose a side. He gave me the role of the loyal son, not the accessory. Agent Harrison cleared his throat. The legal framework of the trust is sound. Ethan and Olivia will face serious fraud and conspiracy charges. Attempted institutionalization and illegal restraint carry heavy penalties in this state. They are finished, Catherine. I stood up, the USB heavy in my hand. I looked at David, and then at the empty spot on the floor where the Rodin pedestal once stood. The relief of being saved was immense, but the weight of Frank's sacrifice was crushing. He had danced his final solo and left me to complete the choreography. The night was long, punctuated by the professional whispers of the FBI agents and the sterile flash of forensic cameras. Ethan and Olivia had been taken away in handcuffs, their silent, furious expressions a chilling end to their scheme. David gave a full statement, confirming Frank's plan and the evidence he had secured. He looked emotionally shattered, but morally intact. By 4:00 a.m., the house was finally quiet again. Agent Harrison gathered us in the living room, now cleaned of debris but still smelling faintly of Stravinsky's chaos and panic. The case is solid, Catherine, Agent Harrison said, closing his notebook. The forfeiture clause in the trust is watertight. Thorne's competency files are now evidence against him. Olivia and Ethan are done. They sacrificed their inheritance the moment they initiated that legal challenge against you. David looked at the damaged granite pedestal where he had nearly collapsed under the weight of his family's betrayal. What happens to the art, Mom? The entire $15 million collection? I held the small dog tag tightly, the metal cool against my palm. Frank's face from the video flashed in my mind. His exhaustion, his decision, his final love. He hadn't just saved the money, he had given me an opportunity to redefine my future. The collection stays, I said, my voice steady, feeling the strength of Frank's trust flow through me. It stays in the trust, but the trust's purpose changes. I looked at David. Frank set up the Last Dance Perpetual Foundation. He left the mission undefined. He gave me the choice. I stood up, moving to the massive, soundproof double doors that led to Frank's former private gallery. Frank saw beauty in creation, but he also saw the ugliness of greed. He used art to expose their darkness. So you'll sell the collection and donate the proceeds? David asked, his voice cautious. No, that's what they wanted, I replied. Liquidity, cash, that's what drove them to murder. If I just turn it into cash, the money wins. Frank hated the money more than he loved the art. I spent the next week in a whirlwind of meetings with Richard, the lawyer Leo, who was shocked and horrified by the depths of the conspiracy, and Agent Harrison. Leo legally confirmed the irreversible forfeiture. Olivia and Ethan had no claim. David, having served Frank's ethical mission, retained only the small portion of Frank's personal, non-trust assets, mostly personal items, which was his due. My revenge, my socialized revenge, would be quiet, creative, and utterly public. I would use Frank's art, not its cash value, to build a future that contradicted everything Olivia and Ethan stood for. I announced the transformation of the foundation 2 weeks later. It wasn't a press conference, it was a carefully choreographed statement given in Frank's former gallery, with the entire $15 million collection arrayed behind me. The Last Dance. Perpetual Foundation is establishing the Frank and Catherine Art Institute for Movement and Form, I declared. This institution will provide scholarships, housing, and an artistic space for retired performing artists, dancers, musicians, actors, who are often left destitute after their careers end. I explained my vision, using Frank's massive fortune not as a commodity, but as infrastructure. I was turning the entire Greenwich mansion, the symbol of the greed that nearly killed me, into a haven for artists. The collection itself would become a permanent educational exhibit, inspiring new forms of expression. The collection will never be sold, I stated firmly. Its value will be leveraged to sustain the institute, ensuring that artists, whose minds and bodies are often dismissed as unstable or past their prime, just as my family attempted to dismiss me, will find safety, dignity, and a place to continue their creative lives. This was the true healing. I was taking the power of the competency challenge and throwing it back in their faces. I was validating the worth of every aging creative mind. David was the first to applaud. He stayed on to help me transition the complex financial structures into the Institute's endowment. Our relationship, once fractured, was rebuilt on a foundation of shared integrity and Frank's enduring memory. Meanwhile, the repercussions for Ethan and Olivia were swift and severe. The evidence was overwhelming. They were not only facing fraud charges for the art scams and attempted institutionalization, but the forfeiture clause left them financially devastated, unable to afford competent legal counsel for the coming trials. They had nothing left but the hatred they shared for each other. The will reading, scheduled for Monday morning, never happened. Instead, on that Monday, I was signing papers with architects, planning the renovation of the mansion into housing for young, struggling artists and my retired peers. I had been given a second act, a chance to perform my greatest role yet, that of a protector and a benefactor. I looked at the walls, no longer seeing a crime scene, but a blank canvas for a new, beautiful work of art. The memory of Frank's ultimate sacrifice was still painful, but it was now illuminated by the purpose he had given me. My final dance had just begun. The process of transformation was swift and therapeutic. The Frank and Catherine Art Institute for Movement and Form took shape not as a cold museum, but as a living, breathing studio. The grand, silent rooms that had witnessed betrayal were filled with the sounds of possibility, the gentle thud of a dancer's feet, the clear ring of a composer's piano, the low hum of artists discussing technique, not money. David stayed. He resigned from his finance firm and became the Institute's chief financial officer, overseeing the complexities of the trust. He was finally using his sharp mind for something meaningful. Our relationship healed slowly, built not on shared history, but on shared purpose. We were bound by the integrity Frank had forced us to find. Months later, the trial of Olivia and Ethan began. It was a sensation in Connecticut. The wealthy daughter and her artist husband, exposed as fraudsters who used greed to push a man to his chosen death. The evidence was overwhelming. The video, the dog tag, the forged appraisals, and the attempted institutionalization all provided by the FBI and Frank's own intricate planning. I attended every day, not out of malice, but out of necessity. It was the final chapter I had to witness. After 2 weeks, the verdict came down, guilty on all counts of conspiracy, fraud, and illegal restraint. Their forfeiture was permanent. They lost everything. Before the sentencing, I requested a private conversation with Olivia. I met her in a sterile, windowless room at the courthouse. She sat across from me, thinner, stripped of her expensive clothes and her polished facade. She looked defeated, but still retained a hard edge of bitterness. "You look well, mother," she said, the word mother tasting like ash. "I am well, Olivia," I replied calmly. Frank's final gift was freedom, not just for me, but for the art. I turned your greed into a permanent home for creativity. "You gloat," she accused, her eyes flashing. "You ruined my life for $15 million you didn't even want." "I ruined the person you chose to become," I countered gently. "Frank's trust didn't take your inheritance. Your choice to harm me did. The forfeiture clause was simply the mirror reflecting your true nature." I paused, then spoke the hardest truth. "Frank didn't die because he was afraid of you. He died because he was exhausted by the thought of living with your hatred. He chose peace." Olivia finally broke. Her composure dissolved into ragged sobs. "I didn't mean for him to die. We just wanted the money for the debts. Ethan promised we'd be safe." "Ethan was a thief, Olivia. You chose to dance with him," I said. "You had a life, a career, a brother who loved you. You threw it all away for a piece of paper." I stood up. "I don't hate you, Olivia, but I cannot forgive the attempt to steal my sanity. That will take time." As I reached the door, she looked up, her voice small. "What about David? Does he hate me?" "David is working to make amends for the family name," I said. "His focus is on building the institute. He misses the sister he thought he had." That was the last time I saw her. Olivia received a 10-year sentence. Ethan, the mastermind who introduced her to the corrupt art world and the private investigators, received 15. Years later, the Frank and Catherine Art Institute was thriving. The grounds were filled with sculptures commissioned by new emerging artists. The old mansion, once a silent tomb, pulsed with life. I was teaching a weekly masterclass in choreography for retired dancers, strong, vibrant women with stories and bodies that deserved respect. David was there every day, working tirelessly. One afternoon, I received a small, thin envelope. It was from a correctional facility. Inside was a hand-drawn sketch, rendered crudely on prison paper. It was the Rodin sculpture, but instead of agony, the figure was stretching, reaching for the light. A note was attached, written in shaky handwriting. "The discipline of the body is all that is left. I am learning to build, not destroy. Maybe someday I can dance again." Oh. I looked at the drawing, a gesture of fragile hope, a plea for reconciliation. I didn't frame it, but I didn't discard it either. I simply placed it in Frank's old desk drawer, next to the dog tag. Frank's final lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about the resilience of the human spirit. The true victory wasn't locking my daughter away. It was building a legacy of hope from the ruins of her betrayal. I had survived, I had healed, and I had learned that the most profound act of love is the creation of a beautiful second chance. And that was the final scene of The Last Dance. Frank's ingenious plan saved the fortune and saved my soul, but it cost me my daughter's freedom. The question I leave you with is this: if you had the power to stop a crime, but the price was sending your own child to prison, would you still pull the trigger on justice? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to check out the next video on screen for another shocking story of family secrets.